My name is Pedro, and I worked as a janitor in an office building for almost 5 years. The night shift was my preference because the silence made the work faster. But that was before that night. Now, I would never take a job like that again. It was an ordinary night. I was cleaning the corridors on the 8th floor, mopping the floor, when I heard the sound of the elevator arriving. Ding! I found it strange because at that time, around 1 a.m., the building was completely empty. There was no one to use the elevator. I stopped what I was doing and went to the floor lobby. The elevator door slowly opened. It was empty. I waited for a few seconds, thinking it could be a system error or a technician testing the machines. But no one showed up. I went back to my work, thinking it was just a weird event. But about 10 minutes later, the elevator rang again. Ding! This time, the door didn't open completely. It closed before I could see inside. It made me uncomfortable, but I still continued working. When I finished on the 8th floor, I went to the 10th, the top floor of the building. There was a large room there, full of tables and chairs, which I needed to organize. As I was arranging the chairs, I heard the elevator arriving once again. But this time, the sound came directly from the floor where I was. The door opened and, again, there was no one inside. I sighed, trying to ignore the discomfort. I decided to get in the elevator to go down to the ground floor and have some coffee. When I pressed the ground floor button, the elevator started to descend, but it stopped alone on the 6th floor, where no one should be. Ding! The door slowly opened, revealing the dark hallway. I looked outside, not having the courage to leave. It was then that I realized there was something wrong with the air. He was cold, as if he had entered a freezer. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing down the hall, but there was no one. They were slow and measured, as if someone were walking towards me. With each step, my breathing became shorter. When the footsteps seemed to be near the elevator door, it closed abruptly, and the elevator began to descend on its own. I reached the ground floor with my legs shaking. I hurried out of the elevator, but as I turned to look at the cabin, I saw something I will never forget. In the elevator mirror, there was a blur, like a person's shadow. The elevator rose again, as if it had a life of its own. After that night, I asked to switch to the morning shift. Whenever I return to the building for visits or occasional services, I avoid the elevators. To this day, other janitors report that the elevators continue to call even when... My name is Marcos, and I worked as a nurse in an old hospital for several years. The place had more than 50 years of history, with narrow corridors and a silence that seemed to amplify every sound. On the night shift, which few had the courage to take on, stories from the 4th floor were constant, but I never took them seriously. Until the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday, my 12-hour shift. The hospital was calm, and most of the patients were asleep. I was in the medical records room, checking the records before making my rounds. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, as if someone was dragging their feet. It's probably a sleepwalking patient, I thought. I got up and went towards the sound, but when I turned into the hallway, there was no one. I stood still for a few seconds, listening intently. The sound stopped, and everything returned to silence. I decided to ignore it and continued my work. About an hour later, I went to room 407 to check on a patient. He was elderly, sedated, and connected to various equipment. I entered the room, carried out the necessary procedures, and was about to leave when I felt a cold wind pass by me. I looked at the window, but it was closed. It was then that I noticed that the curtain next to the bed was moving, as if someone was behind it. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I slowly pulled the curtain, and there was nothing. But as I turned to leave, I heard a low, husky voice. "Can you help me?" My body locked up. It was impossible for the patient to have spoken, as he was sedated and unconscious. I looked at him, and the monitors showed normal vitals. The voice didn't seem to come from anyone else. I took a deep breath, left the room and continued my rounds, trying to ignore what had happened. The peak was around 3 a.m. when I was in the hallway on the 4th floor. I had gone to get some medication from the pharmacy on the floor, and upon returning, I saw a figure quickly pass by me. It was like the silhouette of a woman, dressed in white, who turned left down the corridor. I ran after it, thinking maybe it was a nurse or someone lost. But as I turned the corner, I realized that there was no one there. I looked at the door at the end of the corridor and saw something that gives me goosebumps to this day. Someone's shadow projected on the wall, motionless, even though there was no one there to cast it. The cold in the hallway became unbearable, and I felt a strange pressure in my ears, as if the silence was weighing me down. I hurried back to the medical records room and stayed there until the end of the shift. After that night, I started to believe the 4th floor stories. I don't know what or who is there, but I know that the place holds something that doesn't belong to this world. And when I talk to other nurses, they all have a similar story to. My name is Carlos, and I have worked as a forklift operator in an industrial warehouse for almost a decade. I've always liked what I do, but I avoid early morning shifts as much as possible. The place has a strange energy at night, as if the silence is too heavy. This story happened on a night when I had no choice but to cover a colleague's shift. The warehouse was gigantic, with metal shelves that went all the way to the ceiling. I had to organize boxes in an area close to the main hallway where the lights were dimmer. The silence was only broken by the sound of the forklift and occasionally by some noise coming from outside, like the wind shaking the metal doors. Around 2 a.m., I felt something was wrong. I was maneuvering the forklift to pick up a pallet when I heard the sound of something falling in the next aisle. I got off the machine and went to check. When I arrived, I didn't see anything on the floor, but I swear I heard quick footsteps echoing between the shelves, as if someone was running for cover. I got back on the forklift, trying to ignore the discomfort, but the discomfort only increased. As I was organizing the boxes, I started to hear something stranger, whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound became clearer. It was a low, indistinct voice, repeating words I couldn't understand. I looked around, searching for any sign of anyone else in the warehouse. We were closed, and I knew I was the only one there that night. Still, the whispers seemed to surround me, coming from several directions at once. Suddenly, the lights started to flicker. It wasn't uncommon for the system to fail, but this time it was different. The darkness came in pulses, and each time the light returned, it seemed as if the shadows on the shelves had moved. I continued working faster now, just wanting to finish the shift, but then something happened that made me stop. As I was stacking a box on the top shelf, I heard a loud metallic sound, as if a bar had fallen from one of the supports. I looked back and saw one of the shelves shaking, even though no one was around. With my heart racing, I decided it was time to check the security cameras. I walked to the monitoring room, where the monitors showed various perspectives of the warehouse. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed something in the hallway where I had been working minutes before. A shadow was there, in the corner of the screen, motionless. It wasn't the shadow of a shelf or some object. It was a dark, humanoid shape that didn't move, even when the camera swayed slightly. I turned off the monitor and decided to wait out the rest of the shift at the office. I didn't return to the warehouse floor that night. The next day, I told my colleagues, and they looked at me with a mixture of fear and understanding. I wasn't the first to report strange things in that place. After that, whenever I need to work in the early hours of the morning, I feel the whispers accompanying me, even if nothing else happens. It's as if something in that... My name is Antonio, and I have been a freight train operator for over 15 years. I've always enjoyed my job, but one night in particular completely changed the way I view night travel. This story took place on an isolated stretch of track that runs through a remote area between small towns. It was an ordinary night, with a clear sky and the rhythmic sound of steel wheels on the tracks. My commute was long, but I was used to it. Around 2 a.m., I reached a point known to be quite deserted. There was no lighting, no houses nearby, just trees on both sides and the faint glow of the moon illuminating the tracks ahead. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw something unexpected. A man was standing beside the tracks, waving frantically. He wore simple clothes, a white shirt and dark pants, and seemed desperate for me to stop. My first reaction was alert. Why would someone be there, in the middle of nowhere? I slowed the train as much as I could and prepared to come to a complete stop. When the train got closer, the man simply disappeared. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He just disappeared, as if he had never been there. I got goosebumps, but I still went down to check. I took a flashlight and started inspecting the tracks. There was no sign of the man, but as I walked a few meters ahead, I found something that chilled me to the bone. A section of the track was broken. The damage was serious. The steel bars were bent outwards, as if something had pressed against the rails with extreme force. If I hadn't stopped, the train would certainly have derailed, and the heavy load it was carrying could have caused a disaster. I picked up the radio to report the problem to the center, but the signal was strange, full of static. Even so, I managed to report the situation and ask for help. While waiting, I kept looking around. There was absolute silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel watched. That's when I heard it. First, quick steps on the rocks along the tracks, as if someone was running. Then a low, hoarse voice that I couldn't understand clearly. It seemed to be calling for help, but the source of the sound was always out of range of the flashlight. When the repair team arrived, I reported everything that had happened. One of the workers, an older man, looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. A lot of people have seen him. They say he's an old railroad man who died trying to fix the tracks before an accident. Maybe he's still trying to save others. After that night, I began to hear more stories about that area of the railroad. Colleagues told of similar sightings. A man waving, always at the same point and always before a serious problem on the tracks was discovered. Today, every time I pass that stretch, I slow down and look to the side. I never saw the man again, but I know he's there, somehow,